This is day 5 of the September 90 7-day retreat at Springwater. I didn't write down as much since yesterday, but here is what I did write down. Can one learn to be more attentive? Actually, there was quite a bit of concern with the whole problem of sorrow and suffering. Isn't sorrow an integral part of the human condition? Loss is inevitable, starting with the loss of the mother's breast, even loss of the safe, warm location inside the uterus. But this loss can become the motion or the motivating force for our later development of our capacities for doing things in this world. To me, remembering back the sense of very little self, not much self, was linked with dependency on others. And maybe now the fear of loss of self is linked with the fear of new dependency. And yet there's wondering whether there can be a living without self, without dependency. When I see someone suffering, I feel the pain, the agony of that person as though it was taking place right within me. There is no sense of any border or boundary between myself and the suffering person or the person in pain. But then I observe something else happening. I begin to feel the helplessness of the victim. And then there's despair, and with that feeling of helplessness and despair can come a violent rage against the perpetrator of the suffering. I also see that this is the perpetuation of force and violence and suffering or sorrow. Can this end? This seemingly endless cycle end? Maybe we weren't so clear yesterday on how we use the word sorrow and the word suffering. They are often intermingled, intermixed, used one for the other. And I think they can be used differently. Sorrow being the pain felt at the loss of someone one was very close to, very attached to, shared one's life with, the loss of that person, and the grief, pain, feeling as though there was something ripped out from within one, taken away like an amputation. The pain of that, the sorrow of that. And suffering, maybe we can use, at least as long as we're talking about it. I'm not imposing this on anyone. Suffering could be used the moment one becomes in the story that is created by thought about the incident. The moment one becomes the sufferer, the victim in that story, in that account given by thought and fantasy image to the incident that happened. Picturing oneself, thinking of oneself as that victim, that sufferer of the loss, of the pain, of the heavy fate. Why me is the question. Why should this happen to me? And with these words and thoughts, an increase and complication, a compounding of the pain. That compounding of the pain I would call suffering, at least for the moment. Becoming a sufferer. Just as one can suffer intensely about the fate of someone in a well-made movie or novel, identified with the different characters and suffering their fate as it is presented in story or movie or theater, as though it was actually happening to oneself. Often uncontrollable sobbing in a movie, after a movie. For the fate of the character one was identified with. In a very similar way, one can identify with the story that the brain creates about one's own fate. And it is usually the entering into this story vividly that the same pain that was originally suffered when the loss occurred, we'll keep it simple and just think of loss right now of someone. The same pain can be triggered time and time again, for years, for decades, for a whole lifetime. Recently in a group discussion there was mention of grieving, grief at the loss of someone, and someone questioned whether the grieving itself also has to do with memory. Bringing up in memory one's relationship with that person, the person and oneself, with him or her, and the pain immediately evoked at this memory. And several persons, during and after the discussion, felt there was something cruel and cold to looking at grief in that manner. Is it that we want there to be something more than memory? Or what is it that when one points out the part that thought and image and memory plays in grief, at the death of someone, that there is a feeling that this comes out of coldness. Actually, it's an interesting story that is about a woman who had lost her son and was unable to bury him. Carried him around with her wherever she went, and she heard about the Buddha preaching someplace. So she brought her son there, hoping he would revive the child. And what he asked her was to bring a mustard seed from any house she went to go from house to house in the village, outlying villages maybe, and bring a mustard seed from any house where no death had occurred. And the woman returned empty-handed. And she buried her son. This is not pointing out the role of memory, because there was this dead corpse still with her. Although, who is this dead person now? The one in particularly this American tradition, all dressed up in a coffin, made to look rosy. Who is it? The person who just died? The person a year before that? 10 years before that? The one remembers from early age? Who is it? And what in that is memory? Can one, when this occurs in one's life, as it occurs in all our lives, look at it? Or will one refuse to look and stay with the image of the sufferer? Or why does one want to stay with grief if one has grieved? Is there a feeling of obligation to continue grieving? There is such a thing. That one is cold or does not show the love one had for this person. If one doesn't continuously bring up the memory and get into a state of suffering or grieving. Can one look at all of that without thinking that there is lack of feeling in that? Lack of warmth or lack of love? Or lack of love in the person who talks about that? There's so much taboo around that, and so much sentiment. So coming back to the question, isn't loss an integral part of the human condition? It is, isn't it? It starts at the moment of birth. Must be considerable discomfort, even though nowadays there's some growing recognition of this and trying to make the newborn more comfortable, not so traumatically changed in its conditions. The loss of the breast, if one ever had one, many children have never had it, many babies. Or the loss of the bottle. The loss of the sole attention of the mother when she has another child or goes out to work and someone else takes care of the baby. And the person was saying, isn't this loss with the energy of whatever is aroused, sadness, grief, the energy of sorrow, isn't that a motivating force later in life? To what? To get new satisfaction, being newly the center of attention, being fulfilled in a more mature way. But the wanting is still there, isn't it? There can be new fulfillments, new gratifications, new sources of attention, of feeling loved, and yet it never completely fulfills because the wanting is still there. That's part of the human condition. But is that an unalterable part of the human condition, that wanting is the thread that winds through our life, the red thread, wanting and fearing, out of the sense of separation from the whole, which occurs so dramatically at birth. And that's what we're questioning here, this whole sense of separation. It's got a tremendous boost at the moment of birth. There it is, there's a separation. No longer the warm, liquid sack with food, not just upon demand, it's just flowing in. Because other things may happen inside the uterus. The emotional life of the mother there's more and more research on that too, the impact of that upon the fetus. But questioning the sense of separation that lies so deep in every human being, we're born with it. And we verbalize it in our language. in our education. I remember when we adopted a little 6-day-old baby whom we couldn't see for 6 days. The mother couldn't see him for 6 days. That were the adoption procedures. So who knows where he was for 6 days? He was in a ward. Not with the mother, not with the adopting parents. I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, yes. At that time, having this baby come at short notice, 6 days plus the time of the telephone call by the doctor, I resorted to Dr. Spock. That became my Bible, not just mine, Kyle's and mine, to read up about all the possibilities, contingencies, and there's a lot of Dr. Spock and Dr. Spock. And in the friends around you at that time who had their children or were telling you, don't spoil this baby. Don't carry this baby around too much. It'll become attached to you, it'll become clingy. Put him down. Let him cry. And probably from my own babyhood something reverberated. Not that I remembered, but I was told by our cook. When she came, when she was hired, and she made the condition that she would have nothing to do with those 3 children because she didn't like children. She came to cook. And when she heard that baby crying on the balcony, which was me, she felt sorry for that little baby and picked it up. My mother mustn't have been around, because my mother felt and told us that it's good for babies to cry. It develops their lungs. And she felt that. She was raised that way. So a strong bond developed to Lisbeth, our cook. I've talked about it at other occasions. But friends recommending, Dr. Spock suggesting not to carry this. At that time, I didn't see anyone with slings around who was carrying their baby, which was what I really wanted to do. But the social pressure was otherwise, and there was being accustomed to listening to that rather than to one's intuition, one's feelings. So of course with that comes more feeling in the baby of being separate. And the pain of that, the pain to the mother. But then, in addition to this physical separation, which is probably quite traumatic and leaves memory traces, pre-verbal, non-verbal, in the body, there comes the constant verbalization about being me and the commands, the admonitions, the injunctions to behave, to be good, the praises and blames, which all imply being separate, responsible for one's behavior, as though one could choose it, choose to be bad or choose to be good. Of course, the rewards and punishments have the impact, have the influence. Whatever is the most rewarding is very likely to bring about a certain behavior, and whatever is the most punishing or painful will inhibit behavior. It's not that I want to be good or want to be bad, but the rewards, the consequences have tremendous effect. Pleasure has tremendous effect upon the continuation of behavior. And yet at the same time, one is told that one chooses to be this way. Either directly or by implication. That it's up to one how to act. That one is an independent agent, learning to know good from bad, which happens, but one learns pleasure-bringing behavior from punishment-bringing behavior or pain-producing behavior. This is what is learned. How do we come to feel so separate, so isolated, so lonely, which is the disease of so many people? Aching loneliness and the depression that comes from it. Is that in large part to the story we tell ourselves about ourselves and the impact of that story? If one sees oneself as a failure or an unfriendly person, and non-lovable, not as lovable as brothers and sisters, then that has also, just like reward and punishment, tremendous impact on our way of being with other people. Thinking we're not lovable, we don't dare reach out. There's the fear of rejection. Thinking me in terms of this context all the time, or most of the time, as we grow older. Little babies don't have that intact yet, that whole structure, that whole me, memory, thought, image structure. And that is why there is such openness to the surroundings. Even in the beginning, openness to strangers, unless trauma has already happened. Not separate from the surroundings, because everything is responded to as a whole movement, in harmony with the movement of the surroundings. I got off from our original questions. No, this came out of the question, isn't the pain and sorrow of separation, of loss, an integral part of the human condition? It is. And the making of the story is also an integral part of the human functioning. And yet, just because it functions so automatically, universally in all of us, and is universally not noticed as storytelling and story creating, it's seen and felt universally as real. Just because that is what is happening in human beings, in me and everyone, doesn't mean we can't question it and wonder radically whether it can change, can be exposed, seen into, and therefore lose its momentum of automaticness, of habit, of mechanical functioning, through insight, through seeing, through observing that. So that suffering at the hand of the story can end by seeing it as a story. The event has long passed. The initial pain has long abated, whether it's from physical wound or psychological wound, but it is the storyline that keeps it alive. Me and my sad situation. What will bring insight into that? That it is suddenly seen for what it is. Not just thought about. People say this to me. Sometimes I can't stand it anymore when you say, well, this is just thought. It doesn't help a thing. I resent it. I can say that too. It's just thought. And that's not enough. It's not enough to say that. As we see that this is so. And in a seeing which reveals the truth, there's no separation, because it doesn't come from thought, which is a separating agent. It is a fragment in itself. Thought is not the whole. It is limited. It cannot see the whole, cannot understand the whole. But seeing thought as thought is liberating. No story about liberation, no matter what energy and enthusiasm, inspiration it brings, can really liberate. Because inspiration and enthusiasm that is created by thought fizzles like fireworks. And it doesn't reveal the truth about thought and its impact on this whole body, on its moods, causing deep, prolonged depressions, leaving aside for the moment the possibility that depressions may be chemically produced. But all of us know the power of the way we think about ourselves, how we are treated, how no one loves us, how we will never find a mate, someone who loves us the way we need to be loved. The depressive power of those thoughts we know. And yet then, what can one do about these thoughts? Attention or awareness or insight is not something that thought can do. Thought being the me. I can't do it. And that is often a cause for despair for people. I can't do anything about this. I'm helpless. And with making new storyline, there's more depression about my helplessness. Or rage, as someone said. When I feel helpless, eventually there'll be a feeling of rage at the situation or at the perpetrator of my helplessness. All of that is the power of thinking, which goes unrecognized as thinking. You can say, wait a minute, I know that I'm thinking that, but is that more thinking? When it's direct insight, then it's very clear. Because the energy that's tied up in this whole separation complex is released in the awareness. It is now the attention, the energy of attention, of awareness. Maybe just for a fraction of the moment. And it is usually a fraction of a moment because thought so quickly can come in and say, wait a minute, what's happening? I want more of this, or this is scary. I may lose myself. Myself being my idea of myself, my account of myself. And with that thought comes new bodily moods and feelings. All of that observable like a vast panorama of living in thought and feelings. It is observable, that's the miracle. And also in watching thoughts, getting glimpses here and there when the moment of attention comes, in giving attention to the content of one's thoughts, in really working this way, not just saying, well, it's no use, or why do this, rather sit, one person said, rather sit according to the principle that practice is already enlightenment, meaning sitting cross-legged quietly, that is already the manifestation of enlightenment. If one believes that, this belief can give one a tremendous amount of strength, but not much insight into the process of thinking about enlightenment and practice being enlightenment. So, if one looks at this stuff, grapples with it, then, amazingly enough, the thought process does slow down and become more observable. The whole processes slow down in quiet sitting, walking, careful, eating, but where one doesn't have to carry on conversation. Everything seems to slow down. One can see leaves of trees moving that one has never seen before, because something has slowed down to see it, to take it in. So even though there is sorrow in losing someone, the instant loss and to what one was used to, the pain of that, mixed up with thought, of course, remembrance. But one does not have to become an eternal sufferer. Suffering can end with the storyline. When that is seen, and in seeing it, ending it, realizing one doesn't have to continue with the story because the real life is right here. In this seeing, there is an intelligence that is operating, which has nothing to do with the intelligence of IQ, of thought. It is seeing what is story and seeing what is real. And without conscious choice, staying with the real. That's possible. If you say all the time, no. That's again imagination. We should be perfect all the time, have what we want all the time, and with that comes this whole time sense we talk about some other time. Coming back now to the first question about sorrow, feeling the sorrow of someone else, the pain, physical or mental agony in someone else, as though it was happening in oneself, as though one was that person, no boundary. That happens when there's not this total caught upness in me and my problems, which consumes the energies and happens in a tight space. But when that abates, for whatever reason, maybe seeing someone suffering or in sorrow, in pain, knocks out this concern with oneself. And one can see what is going on in another person. It doesn't have to be judged. It's so evident, it's so obvious. A child being humiliated or treated violently. No judgment is needed. It's so obvious what is happening. And one can already see the consequences of it because one understands it in oneself. So, can one see sorrow and suffering around one without going into a gradual rage about it? Because that was the question. First I just see and feel that in myself. Then I feel the helplessness. And with feeling the helplessness, the rage. Wanting to do violence to the perpetrator. We know that, don't we? Maybe just from watching movies or reading or seeing news, where one wants to lash out or interfere with the one who's doing the violence. And maybe if one finds oneself in a situation where one could prevent something, maybe one would do it. I don't know. Stop a mother from beating a child, would one do that? Hit her oneself. The person was talking about at times a killing rage, and then wondering whether this is just perpetuating the whole cycle of violence. Someone asked me a question like that in the last retreat, never responded to it in the talk. What would you do if your child was attacked by someone else? Would you just love that person? I don't know right now what I would do. The situation would have to arise. Everything else is speculation. Because the feeling is one would protect that child and die first. Put it behind one, protect it, guard it. Rip the gun out of the, I think that was the question at the time, a gun pointed at your child. Rip the gun out of the person and kill him or her? I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think so. I don't know. Rip the gun out, yes. Throw it away, yes. But kill someone else? Right now I would say no, I wouldn't do that, but I don't know. But the question, the deeper question was, can violence and suffering end in oneself, come to an end at this moment of seeing it and seeing the whole endless past history of violence stretching into the future, if it doesn't end here, right now, in oneself. Not through repression, not through violence done to the impulse to be violent. But can there be this opening which is intelligent? Compassionate, we talked about it yesterday. Not the idea of compassion, but the absence of rage at someone else who would do a thing like that. What has happened to him or her to want to attack a child? What kind of a child was he or she? We wouldn't be violent if we didn't feel separate and caught up in a web of a story about our badness or other people's badness. We weren't wrapped up in this web of imagery. We wouldn't kill, would we? We wouldn't do violence. Or is it an integral part of living? Somebody takes something from me and there's some energy to lash out. Well, like animals, they don't kill each other over territory or over wives. There's a show of strength and then they part. There's some instinctive intelligence operating there, which is overlaid in us through all this imagery of enemy and foe and ally. I don't know whether you saw this documentary of the red elk or red deer on an island, following the whole cycle of the red deer, including the cycle where the males battle, lock horns over one of their harems of does. And while these two males battle and lock horns, the shunned males on the outside walk in quietly and pick their females. By the time the battle of the two is over, the harem is gone. No one was killed, of course. The women didn't have their say. But I don't know whether they suffer from that. They're just those with babies that they lick and protect for a while. Grappling with this whole thing, several people have said, and the question comes up all the time, isn't thought, with all of its creation of false images or masquerading for truth which it is not, isn't that thought also a natural occurrence? Isn't it also part of the whole? Of course it is. What else would it be part of? But one sees what it does. One has to ask, first of all, where does my question come from? Is there defensiveness about it? Guilt about having it and wanting alleviation of the guilt of having thoughts? That needs to be dealt with on a different level than looking at whether thoughts are part of the whole. This huge brain has capacity for thought. And so far, there hasn't evolved this instant perception that this is just thought. It comes to us, or we come upon it, it seems, after a laborious life of suffering and wondering and questioning, entering into silence, following all kinds of techniques. The time is almost up, so we'll have to leave that for tomorrow. Whether it is possible to learn to be attentive. So, thought does arise wherever it's coming from. Whatever its past evolution has been, here it is. Can it be seen intelligently, clearly, with its consequences? Without condemnation, guilt, fault-finding. Seeing that too for what it is, more thought with more consequences. See it and do nothing about it, the doer coming to quiet. at least for this moment. We will end here for today.